Deep thoughts. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the show, Carlos.
Hey, Tech. Good seeing you, man.
Good seeing you. Long time no see. So glad to have Carlos on the show from Seedcamp. Yeah, so why don't you tell everybody a 10, 15-second background about yourself as a person,
So
please?
my background is I started off in working in network security consulting. Did that for a few years. Decided to move into investing after I met a few people who were doing that and looked at technology on a daily basis that I was deploying, and I thought that would be a lot of fun. So about 15 years or so ago, I made the transition into venture, and then for the last 13 or so of those years, I've been building out this brand called Seedcamp, which how I got to know you,
Yes.
Tack. For those of you that are listening, um, I had the pleasure of working with Tack while he was at Techstars, which was one of the organizations that we partnered with at the time, and he's also built out this huge network in Hong Kong and the AI initiative that you built. And so Seedcamp's been a an organization built on friendships and working with others. And over the years, that's been Europe wide and even Africa, Asia, U.S. And so we've kept that spirit of building bridges, and trying our best to work with the best founders that we meet in along the journey.
And tell me about that evolution of Seedcamp. When kind of we met, I was at Techstars, and we were focused on seed, and I think we still are from what I understand of the program now. And tell me about that evolution of Seedcamp. I think it was the earliest seed investor back in London, and I was talking to Sarah Drinkwater actually about the evolution of London, right? Of that and Google Campus and all that type of jazz. How has Seedcamp evolved in
Yeah.
your mind?
So I think it's been interesting to come at building an organization through ignorance. Uh, we always envied some of the people that the Techstars network had as starting point access to
Ah,
Silicon Valley, and we always had that insecurity of like, do we copy what people are
mm,
doing in the States?
mm,
Do we build our own thing? Do we approach it differently? And so the one thing that has now become part of the culture is this idea that we're always building something for our customer as we see it on that year.
mm,
And it was our only adaptation to
mm.
not being able to know certainly that we were doing the right thing,
Right,
and not always early days when things weren't very clear if we were doing the right thing. It was a very stressful idea. It was like you
right.
see, for example, the way that YC does things and scale and
Yes.
the people that get involved. You're just like, oh, should we be doing that? And then you're
Yeah.
like, well, is that what my customer, which is obviously the European founders, is that what they need? Is that what they want? And so I think that that's served us well, and so that's who
Mm,
we are. It's a constantly evolving entity. The fund we were 10 years ago is very different than we are today. And
mm,
is what's the main difference? Well, I mean, some things are similar, right? Like we do pre-seed
mm.
and seed, but then the
Okay.
size of pre-seed and seed has changed, right? Like when we
Right.
first started, pre-seed didn't exist and seed was 50K to 100K.
Mm,
Now seed is
mm.
like up to 5 million. And so that just requires a different thinking about how you deal with team, how do you deal with growth. And so all those things matter.
And then my subsequent question usually, yeah, what makes kind of Seedcamp and your fund different? And I think, dare I say it, part of it is saying still being close to the founders and what's required. Is that really kind of the tagline, or is there some other tagline in your mind?
And no, that's I would say that that's very very close to it. I think the only thing I would add to that is that it's a community of founders as well. And I think that
Mm,
that also changed, right? Because with the first fund, we're 20 or so companies. Second fund, we're at an inflection point of 70 or so companies. And then
Mm.
thereafter, it started scaling very quickly. And so now we're at 400 plus. And as you know,
Right.
once you hit a certain number of relationships, the
Right.
Metcalfe's law starts kicking in, right? You start having
Yes.
really good speed on conversion on requests and issues and concerns, and somebody always knows what's going on. And
Right.
so that's the reason why it's so different now than early days Seedcamp was, because now not only do we have that proximity with the founder, as you mentioned, but we also have like, hey, you need something? Pretty sure somebody in the Seedcamp network has it.
And also, actually, now you kind of make me think. I need to kind of talk to some of the old T-Camp guys as well, like Philip and actually, you funded early founders, but I think the people that and Vincent Jacobs as well. Like I reached out to him. You actually not funded, but you incubate or you work with some of the early, some of the other kind of VCs in the business. Like, have you ever kind of thought about that as well?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't. I think you're being very generous there about incubating other people. No, we just had the chance of working with some of our colleagues that are now in other funds, and it's just you're around long enough. People come and they go, and they start companies or they start funds. Ricardo Sequeira at point 0.9, as you
Yes,
mentioned,
that's right.
Vincent.
Yes,
You
yes,
look at Kirsten Campbell, who's now at Octopus Ventures, obviously Pimo at
yes.
Tiny. So it expands, and that's the nature of the community.
Yeah. Yeah, that's yeah, you should be really proud of that actually. Now I think about it, yeah, I've it's been a while. So usually kind of my next question is kind of what your current challenge is. And you can talk about current challenges or past challenges, and I'll kind of add kind of a point to that. What I really admired with actually what you guys did was you guys made a statement together. So the Americans during the whole SVB time, the Americans kind of made a statement and came together. I think a bit late. And what you guys did, I think, was slightly different. Can you talk through that and what you guys did during those 72 hours with Silicon
Yeah, I
Valley
think.
UK?
I mean, I know that we're recording this live. If you're listening to this and you're hearing this part that I'm about to say, it's partially because TAC went straight into the topic of SVB, and it probably merits a little bit of background. So apologies, but the background is we were chatting offline a little bit about what's happened recently with Silicon Valley Bank,
Mm,
cash management in particular, and ultimately everything comes down to a cash management issue, right?
mm,
So your question has multiple parts. One of them is a cash management issue, another one's a political issue, another one is a monetary policy issue, right? Um, and I think that it's a complex one, right? All these things are very, very complex, and your question
mm,
needs to be unpacked across all of them, right? And also, it varies different on different jurisdictions because different
mm.
jurisdictions have different priorities and different
Of
issues.
course. Right.
So I think first of all, the UK is a separate community. It's a smaller community than America, and that has both pros and cons. As you know, going to market in the US means state by state in some cases for different companies, but also means you have a massive market. But within
Mm,
that massiveness comes fragmentation of priorities and political parties and views and stuff. And I think that that's something to be factored in whenever you look at any kind of
right.
story or anything, right? It's not versus in the UK, you have a much smaller geographical footprint,
Mm,
and you have a different governmental structure,
mm,
and you also have a much smaller group of people. And so, I can't comment on how the US handled it because I wasn't there to witness it firsthand, only on Twitter. But I do feel like the context was different.
mm.
And but I think when you take that problem and you unwind it, and I appreciate this is a long-winded answer, but there's so many little subtleties that are worth sort of touching on. So the precursor to all of this is, the fact that SVB is an organization that really stood out for customer service and great products for the entrepreneurial community globally.
Mm,
Did
mm,
everybody use them?
mm.
No, but for where they did serve customers, they were very good at it. And why? Because as you know, like if you build an SUV, it's going to be great off road. If you build a race car, it's really good on the road. And you shouldn't blame people for choosing an SUV if they're going to go off road. And similar, SUV did a great job of building products for founders, You
Mm.
know, there's some banks who don't offer, for example, mortgages to CEOs because they're self-employed technically, and
Right.
and they did. They understood the context. So I think that's one background that's really important to be aware of, is that there was concentration risk around
Mm.
our industry in this bank because of how good it was, you know. And
Right.
I'm not going to comment on what the management did or didn't do on the governance side of things. It's not really for me to say. And also, I have as much details as anybody else does on social media. So it's like what do you call it? A back chair quarterback or whatever it's called. Um,
Monday
it's in
morning
that
bet
category.
quarterback. Yes,
That's right. It's like
that's
it's
right.
not my place to comment. It's not my place to comment on that. But what is clear is that there was a concentration risk on our industry, and I think one of the lessons, to answer your question, one of the lessons was, you know, the need for us to look at how to manage across multiple different places. And I think a lot of great blog posts have been written since this happened on how to
Mm.
best do treasury management, cash management, not only just for inflation and currency management purposes, but also just for diversification of risk. And that's that.
Mm.
Like it is that. Now, so that's one third, right? The other second one is the way that our industry moved speed wise.
Mm.
Now,
Mm.
because
Mm.
of the size, as you know, the smaller something is, the easier it is to get everybody in the room. The bigger it is, the harder it is. And I think that's one of those things where, by the very nature that the UK community is smaller, made it that much more
Mm.
accessible for everyone to sort of come in and have a conversation. We also have two very good representative bodies that are the voice of policy and of customers' needs to government. One is called Codec and one's called BVCA, the British Venture Capital Association. And so both of them were very good stewards of the
Okay,
conversation to the right government officials, right?
got
And
it.
the government was also very keen on hearing what was needed in light of the fact that the government is very much aligned with making the UK a science and technology leader
Mm.
globally, right? And it's
Mm.
something that they've had ambitions for, and most countries do, right? But the UK has, you know, some great innovation and some great research centers that drive that. So there
Mm.
was a good alignment of interest on the receiving
Mm.
end, and there was a good concentration of voice through the two organizations and a small enough community to then channel that. And so that small community, which is the third point, that small community is also very aligned, because
Mm.
what you're aware of is that, you know, you all win or you all don't win, and
Right.
all boats rise, so to speak, right?
Right.
So that's the hopefully the answer that sort of addresses the issue.
Right. So yeah, three factors of this, trying to address it all because it was concentration risk. But yes, everyone has to kind of come up together. There was the interplay with the government side kind of saying, well, what's your response from those two organizations? And then I guess coming together and making a response there. I guess there's one kind of follow up is you can sympathize with the founder and the startups and say, because the Americans were, some VCs were like, get your cash out. And there were some in Techstars actually being an organization that said, calm, 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 calm. Um, I'm not going to point you on a specific response. How did you kind of think about what advice to give founders?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a very controversial one. I think you've seen tons of tweets and podcasts and articles written about whether VCs are to blame or whether people are to blame.
Mm.
And I think it's good to take a context. Um, so the first one is, whenever you take money from other people, in this case a fund manager, you have a fiduciary
Mm.
duty to them, which means you need to take the best
Yes.
actions that you can to preserve the capital and do the right thing. Then at the same time, there is a bigger communal ethical question, which is,
Mm.
do you take actions that exacerbate the well-being of the overall community,
Mm.
country, society that you're in?
Mm.
And 99% of the time, those two things are mutually aligned.
Yes. Yes.
This whole conversation is existing simply because they're not.
Yes.
in
And
this
how do you
case.
resolve that?
And so you resolve that by being very careful about that. I don't think
Mm,
there's a right answer. I think some
mm,
people erred on the one side very visibly, vocally on social media. And on
mm,
the other end, some people were overly hesitant and either struggled at the very last minute or
mm,
did nothing. And I think that I don't know that it helps anyone
mm.
to point fingers. And the reason why I don't think it helps anyone, because it is a spectrum of two mutually exclusive
Right,
commitments and responsibilities. And so
right.
different people will measure that in different ways. I think where the destructive element happens is when there's a lot of signaling of that. That's where the destruction happens. The actual advice isn't the issue. The
Right,
advice is you could take a view either way because they're both
right.
right. But where it becomes difficult is when people start signaling left and right and Twitter and social media. And that's something that we're living in an age where we haven't factored that in. Like, how
And
does
you
that
mean that
affect
that precipitates the bank run?
all actions that sort of broadcast intent
Mm,
generate the wind that moves the sailboat faster?
interesting. So, in summary, you would kind of say there the spectrum of the answer, and every founder has to balance that spectrum according to how they think about it, and that is a choice going
I think
forward.
that there is no there. I don't know that I don't think that we have collectively any kind
Mm,
of clarity on this subject. I don't think there
mm.
is. Like I don't. I've literally I spent as much time as you probably have on Twitter reading accusations from both sides.
Has
How
there been a
could you not do this? Or
post-mortem?
how could you do
Has
this?
there
How could you not do
has there
this?
yeah. Has there been a post-mortem like, oh, okay, we solved the issue. How could we have done better? Just again, is there kind of group post-mortem as well, or did everyone just kind of disband?
No, there was postmortem, but I don't think it happened collectively. I think it happened sort of individually. People thought, oh, we could
Okay.
have done, and that's why I'm saying like there's a whole bunch of content that's come out on that end. And
Mm,
honestly, like if tomorrow this were to happen all over again, first of all, there's lessons. There's like three types of lessons learned, right? One of them is cash management. I think we all
yes.
know how to do that better,
Yep.
right? The other one has to do with community management, which is the question you were asking me earlier. It's like some people look at what others did, the bad actors, and say,
Mm,
I could have done this or I could have done that, but did I need to say that? Did I need to exacerbate that? Did I need to do this? Or if they didn't do it, did somebody else do it? And should I be more like them or less like them? And I think that a lot of
mm,
people will recalibrate on that. And I think,
mm.
as with most things in society, like you realize these people were harmful voices, these were good voices. Does that mean that we won't have people pop up, new voices pop up? No, but I think
Sure.
people will think twice about which
Right.
one of those positions they take and how they represent them and how
Yeah.
they publicly or privately communicate them, right? And the third thing people have learned is crisis management. Because whichever way you look at it, it was a crisis.
Mm,
It was a crisis for everyone. It's a crisis for
mm.
all the bank workers, which were absolute heroes in staying up
Yes.
late. I'm not talking about
Yes.
management. Huh? I'm not talking about the bank management. I'm not going to make comments on them, but I'm just talking about
Sure.
the average bank worker, man. I know a lot of bank workers were up late talking to customers, trying to
Mm,
help as much as they could. You know,
mm,
it's not their fault. Like they were, but these people were dealing with very difficult situations. So the banks were affected, the bank employees were affected. You know, CEOs, startup founders were affected, dealing with notifying their investors what
mm,
was going on, the cash situation. Then there was players in the ecosystem who were stepping up to figuring out how to. I heard some really inspiring stories from some investors in the states who were just writing blank checks. You know,
okay. Right.
um,
Oh, I see where
they
you
had the
that.
facility
Yeah.
to. Not everybody has the facility to do that. I mean, this isn't like a name and shame thing, right? It's like
Mm,
some people had that ability, and when they
mm,
had it, they did it. They facilitated it, and that's freaking amazing. That they did that, and but also more importantly, like individually, I think CEOs, founders, fund managers, and everyone is like, what is triage? Like I think
mm,
this because you were in the U.S. Army. Like, what is triage? What is
mm,
taking? What is most important for us here? How do I put my
mm,
employees first? If you're a founder, how do I put
Mm,
my creditors, first? How do I manage
mm,
cash? How do I manage my employees' expectations, communications? How do I do my shareholders? How do I tell them? That was
mm.
awkward for a lot of people. How do I tell them? Because it's an admission
Right.
of you might have done something wrong. Like in some cases, I think most people were pretty empathetic. Like, yeah,
Right.
you kind of, it's not your fault. But other people weren't so empathetic, huh? They're like, you should have known
Mm,
better. And so,
right.
crisis management and stakeholder management was a huge part of the learning. So those are the three main things. So how would people respond publicly? How do they manage cash? And then how would they deal with crisis?
That third lesson actually seems to be something that again, maybe people didn't think about before, but founders perhaps should think about going forward. And this, it could be this kind of repeat of this crisis, but again, this playbook would apply to different crises. Um, Last question, just kind of moving on. If you were to build, I end this question with everybody, which is why we're gonna kind of have to ask you, Carlos. If you were to build Seedcamp differently, rewind 15 years ago, has it been about 10, 15 years ago? How would you do things differently?
So first of all, I think with the ethos of what we have built would be the same. So I'm glad to say I wouldn't do
Yep.
that any differently. The culture and the values and the sort of the people that we've hired and the kind of decisions we've made on that end, I think they were all the right ones to make at the time. And I'm taking your answer and I'm contextualizing it to the time, right? Because if we started in 2023, I think it would be a different thing. It wouldn't even exist, I don't think. So
Mm,
what if I knew now, but I would bank it back in time, I would make the same decisions with one exception. And that exception is everything that I did personally. I think that as a leader, I've been learning quite a bit
okay.
and I've made some mistakes. Like I've made some mistakes personally in little things and I
Okay.
beat myself up over them sometimes because they sometimes they're micro adjustments in the wrong direction with colleagues or with leadership. I'll give you a silly one. I mean, this isn't silly. It's silly or it isn't silly, but I'll give you an example of what I mean. Like about maybe 10 years ago now, a long time ago, we were traveling to the US um, and we didn't really have an endless budget for expenses. But I wasn't very good at communicating what our expense policy should be because we didn't really
Mm,
have one. And I know
mm,
that that laziness made it, or I wouldn't maybe say laziness, that sort of lack of forethought made it such that some of my colleagues were stressed about the expenses while abroad. It's a simple little
right.
thing, but it meant that their behavior during while we were doing stuff was changed because they were in wait, am I going to get reimbursed for this or I'm not going to be reimbursed for this? you
Mm,
know and so it was a leadership mishap on my part, you know and but it affects culture because you don't
mm,
people don't necessarily know, well, am I covered, am I not covered, what should I do, how should I prioritize, and that's a silly one, maybe not so silly, but one, I'm happy to share. But there's tons of those kinds of decisions. Did I lose my temper with somebody at one point, and why? Was
mm,
it because of an
mm,
ego thing or not? Was it, did I one of the worst moments of me being upset about something I did was um, I had one investor who did something that I don't know it was the right thing for them to do, but instead of
mm,
confronting them directly, I sort of kind of went around it, and then it blew up
mm,
in my face. And I'm
mm,
like, you know what? Whenever that shit happens now, I just call the person up and I say, man, look, I heard this. I don't know if you intended it, but
mm.
this is how I feel about it. Um, and that was a
Yeah,
lack of bravery at the time, maybe.
not to pardon you, but having said that, like you guys started C Camp, Reshma started C Camp from scratch. And do you think part of it is part of the learnings of that journey, right? It was just literally you had no playbook. If you had a playbook, I mean, obviously we all wish we had a playbook, but it was, yeah, you had to discover a lot of things.
You do, and you learn lessons the hard way, right? And I think the lessons that hurt the most are people lessons. Like
Mm,
when people survive something like the SVB crisis and find another bank account, that's fine. Like
right.
you've learned that lesson. You will never make that mistake again, right? You will never make that
Right.
mistake. But at the same time, it was an unprecedented circumstance. So there's a limited scope to your guilt. Like
Right.
it's guilt, but when you make a character decision mistake,
Mm.
those haunt you. And that's where sometimes it's great to have a coach. That's where it's great sometimes to have a co-founder who you can talk about those things. You know, my colleague Reshma has been great at. We've had tons of chats over the years with these kinds of things where we're like, damn, we could have done this better. We could have done that better. This was really tricky. And I really feel for people who are alone in their journeys because it's not easy.
And it's funny. It's actually there's actually a lot of conversation about solo GPs, right?
Mm,
And I think part of it you're kind of highlighting the issue, right? You can be a solo GP. That's not the hard part. It's investing. That's not the hard part. It's perhaps going through the journey and learning the lessons that you're learning by yourself. That's and not having this feedback loop.
yep.
That may be the hard part. Well, thank you for that lesson. I wish we could go into it a little bit longer, but I'm gonna call it short.
I wouldn't
So
call it a
thank you.
lesson, dude. I call it like a life experience
Battle
more than a
scars.
lesson. Battle scars.
Battle scars. Cool. Thank you very much, sir. All right, we're gonna stop the recording here.